In the spring of 1945, across the endless waters of the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese High Command sat behind maps filled with red and blue pins. They believed they understood the rhythm of the war, the limits of the enemy, and the endurance of their empire. Calculations, scribbled on paper, suggested that about 90 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers would be the maximum number America could send against them at once. It was a confident estimate, drawn not from arrogance but from the belief that the Pacific's vast distances, America's logistical challenges, and Japan's fierce defensive resolve would restrict any bombing campaign to a manageable scale. 90 aircraft, they said, 90 machines of steel and fire. That was the number they told themselves they could endure. But across the ocean, in vast airfields and planning rooms, the Americans were not thinking in the same limits. They were thinking in terms of overwhelming power, total commitment, and absolute victory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On the Japanese home islands, life continued under the shadow of constant uncertainty. Propaganda filled the airwaves, promising victory and divine protection, while the reality on the ground told a different story. Civilians toiled in factories that were constantly relocated to avoid enemy attacks. Exhausted workers labored day and night, hands blistered and backs bent. Supplies ran low, fuel was scarce, and food rations were tightening with each passing week. The once vibrant cities were now dotted with air raid shelters and blackout curtains. Yet, despite the hardship, the government maintained a facade of unbroken morale. Radio programs praised the bravery of the imperial forces, and newspapers printed inflated stories of victories that no longer existed. Behind the curtain of pride and propaganda, however, the Japanese war machine was groaning under its own weight. At the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, military strategists studied reports from radar stations and reconnaissance missions. They monitored the growing reach of the United States Army Air Forces, known as the USAAF, as it extended its operations from India, from China, and most dangerously, from the recently captured Marianas. The staff understood the technological leap represented by the B-29 Superfortress. They knew it was unlike any aircraft they had faced before. It could fly higher, farther, and faster than the Japanese fighters could comfortably intercept. Yet they took comfort in the assumption that America could not sustain large numbers of them over such a distance. The Pacific, they believed, would protect them, as it always had an oceanic shield separating the mainland from the invader. Still, unease lingered beneath their confidence, a quiet awareness that something larger might be coming. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was thinking on a completely different scale. Inside command centers buzzing with activity, planners debated not how to limit strikes, but how to unleash their full might. The concept of sending 90 bombers seemed laughably small to the architects of American air power. They were no longer discussing a handful of raids to weaken Japan. They were planning a campaign that would bring the empire to its knees. The B-29 program had become the centerpiece of America's strategy. It represented the peak of engineering, industry, and ambition. Thousands of men and women worked day and night in factories across the mainland, assembling aircraft, engines, and bomb loads. Tens of thousands of parts were shipped across the world to newly constructed airfields carved into volcanic rock on islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each of these airfields was a monument to American determination. Built under a brutal tropical heat and constant enemy threat, they stretched for miles across the rough island terrain. Bulldozers, cranes, and thousands of laborers transformed jungles and coral into runways capable of launching and landing the heaviest bombers ever built. On these runways stood the silver giants, the B-29 Superfortresses, lined in perfect rows, their fuselages gleaming under the Pacific sun. Every plane represented months of planning, every mission a symphony of logistics that stretched from California to the Marianas. The effort was staggering. Fuel, bombs, spare engines, and food for crews had to cross an ocean. Engineers built airstrips while soldiers defended them. Medics treated heatstroke, mechanics worked through the night, and pilots trained relentlessly for what was to come. By late spring, as cherry blossoms began to fall in Tokyo, the United States had finished what it needed to begin its most devastating phase of the war. The bases in the Marianas were now fully operational, launching points from which the American air fleet could strike deep into the Japanese homeland. Reconnaissance photos flooded into command rooms, revealing target after target: industrial plants, fuel depots, shipyards, and densely packed urban centers. Every detail mattered: wind speed, temperature, distance, even the layout of wooden buildings that would soon feed the firestorms. The Japanese intelligence service noticed the increased movement of aircraft in the Marianas. Reports trickled in, suggesting that the Americans were amassing forces beyond anything seen before. Analysts reviewed intercepted communications, and though they sensed an escalation, their assumptions still capped the danger at a few hundred aircraft at most. Their models could not fathom the idea of 1,000 bombers attacking simultaneously. The mindset of limitation persisted. They saw the enemy as powerful but still bound by practical constraints. The Pacific was vast, surely. America could not send more than a few waves at a time. In the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's advisors held long discussions under the faint glow of electric lamps. The walls of their underground meeting rooms echoed with cautious optimism. Japan had endured years of war and believed it could endure more. They had survived bombings, naval blockades, and defeats in the Philippines and Burma. The military still possessed carriers, fighters, and soldiers who would rather die than surrender. The war, though desperate, still seemed winnable to those sitting around the polished table. The conversation circled the same topic: what could America truly bring to bear? One officer suggested that if the Americans ever managed to send 1,000 bombers in a single operation, Japan's ability to resist would collapse instantly. The others dismissed it with nervous laughter. The idea seemed absurd, a number so high it defied reason. They trusted in the limits of human endurance, the limits of machines, and the vastness of the Pacific. But in the silence of those same nights, as sirens echoed faintly in the distance, some of them wondered if they were wrong. Reports of increasing raids over smaller cities showed coordination unlike before. More planes were being sighted, more bombs falling, and the gaps between attacks were shrinking. Even those who dismissed the idea of 1,000 bombers felt the anxiety of inevitability creeping in. By early June, American preparations reached their peak. In hangars across Tinian and Saipan, mechanics tuned engines, loaded bombs, and checked instruments. Pilots studied maps, tracing the route that would take them over the vast Pacific to the heart of Japan. Commanders reviewed weather reports, waiting for a clear window. The mission, still unnamed publicly, was whispered among the crews as something unprecedented. They knew the scale, even if the world did not. They knew that the sky itself would soon be filled with the thunder of their engines. At the same time, Japan's intelligence network caught glimpses of the growing American activity. Spies reported that hundreds of bombers were being assembled in the Marianas. Dispatches described vast formations, practicing formation, flying, and nighttime navigation. Yet, when these reports reached Tokyo, they were diluted, softened, or simply ignored. Confidence blinded the leadership. "They cannot send so many," one official insisted. "Even America has limits." But America had decided that limits no longer applied. Then came the evening that would mark a turning point in Japanese confidence. Inside an underground command bunker in Tokyo, lit by flickering oil lamps, officers gathered around a map of the Pacific. Their faces were drawn, their uniforms crisp but weary. An air defense strategist, younger than the rest, spoke words that made the room fall silent. "We cannot stop them if they send 1,000. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. For a brief moment, everyone understood what they truly faced: an enemy with endless factories, endless fuel, endless determination. But the thought was too unbearable to entertain. The commander-in-chief cleared his throat, dismissed the young man's statement as an exaggeration and shifted the discussion to the next day's defense plan. The room nodded in agreement, but beneath the polite discipline, doubt had begun to take root. While Tokyo debated numbers and possibilities, the reality was already unfolding across the sea. On the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the American air fleet was being assembled like pieces on a chessboard. Rows upon rows of bombers stood ready, crews resting in makeshift tents, mechanics performing final checks. Generators hummed, fuel trucks rumbled, and the entire horizon shimmered with heat. The B-29, once just a prototype plagued with engine troubles, now stood as a perfected machine of destruction. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly higher than anti-aircraft guns could easily reach. Its range meant it could cross the Pacific and return without refueling. Its remote-controlled guns provided defense from any angle. To the Americans, it was the perfect symbol of technological triumph. To the Japanese, it would soon become a symbol of inescapable doom. As the humid nights passed, final orders were issued. American commanders reviewed target maps pinned to briefing room walls. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe were marked with red circles. The plan was massive, a synchronized wave of destruction so complete that it would render Japan's war industry paralyzed. What Japan had predicted as 90 bombers would soon multiply into 10 times that number. In the final days before the operation, some American officers felt the weight of what they were about to do. Letters were written, folded neatly, and kept in flight jackets. Crews laughed around mess tables, masking the tension with bravado. Knew that the next mission would be remembered in history. Across the Pacific, the Japanese still believed they could withstand whatever was coming. They had survived years of war and fire. Surely they could endure one more raid. But the storm that was gathering across the sea was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Americans had not come to send 90, they had come to send hundreds ultimately, 1,000 B-29 bombers in a single, crushing wave. The sky would soon burn brighter than any sunrise, and the Japanese would finally understand that their estimate, their confidence, and their belief in endurance had all been wrong. The warning had never truly come, but its shadow was already falling. The countdown to the storm had begun. In the humid weeks that followed the American victories across the Central Pacific, the machinery of war reached a tempo that no empire on Earth had ever witnessed. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, once a costly experiment, plagued with engine fires and mechanical flaws, had evolved into a symbol of industrial might. Each aircraft, crewed by 11 men, represented not just the sum of metal and rivets, but the concentrated will of a nation determined to end the war by the force of the sky. It carried more fuel, more bombs, and more range than any bomber before it. Its remote-controlled turrets, its pressurized cabin, and its radar navigation were all marks of technological superiority. Yet behind every gleaming fuselage stood the invisible army of workers, tens of thousands of women and men in factories across Kansas, Washington, and California, who worked without pause, driven by posters that read, "Finish the fight." From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the newly seized islands of the Marianas, the Pacific became an assembly line of destruction. Engineers carved runways out of coral and volcanic stone, long enough to host the wingspan of these massive aircraft. Bulldozers roared, construction crews laboured under the blazing sun, and supply ships unloaded cargo at a relentless pace. The bases became living cities of war, with rows of tents, warehouses, control towers, and fuel dumps stretching as far as the eye could see. Each morning, the air smelled of gasoline, sea salt, and burnt oil. Mechanics worked through the night, wrenches echoing in the dark, their hands blistered, their uniforms blackened by sweat and soot. The roar of engines became the island's heartbeat. From these airfields, the United States Army Air Forces prepared for something unprecedented. Intelligence officers pored over aerial photographs of the Japanese home islands. Maps were pinned to walls, covered in red circles marking industrial targets. Steelworks in Osaka, oil refineries in Yawata, dockyards in Yokohama, the complex sprawl of Tokyo itself. Analysts debated which cities would break first, which railways could cripple transport, which fuel depots could burn the longest. Each target was part of a growing mosaic, the blueprint of Japan's destruction. Across the Pacific, in Japan's war rooms, the mood grew increasingly tense. Reports from regional air commands spoke of reconnaissance planes sighted high above the clouds, B-29s flying at altitudes too great for most interceptors. The Japanese High Command issued new directives: increase air patrols, reposition anti-aircraft guns, enforce civilian blackout drills. Sirens wailed in coastal cities almost daily. In Tokyo, schoolchildren carried small buckets of water and shovels to fight potential fires, while mothers stacked sandbags near wooden homes. But still, the belief persisted that the enemy could only strike in limited numbers. The Imperial General Headquarters concluded that America's logistical strain would prevent mass formations. Their estimate around 90 bombers remained doctrine. To them, 90 was survivable, containable, even endurable. The Americans, however, had no intention of being contained. In Washington, in the dark offices of the War Department, strategists spoke of a new kind of warfare: saturation bombing, the total collapse of industrial capacity, and the shattering of civilian morale. The phrase strategic paralysis circulated in memos: cripple the machine, and the man behind it cannot move. General Curtis LeMay, a blunt and relentless tactician, was appointed to command the XXI Bomber Command. His philosophy was simple: efficiency through terror. He intended to make the skies above Japan burn with the intensity of 1,000 suns. By late May, the plans had matured. The operation, codenamed Stormfront in preliminary drafts, would call for 1,000 B-29 bombers to strike in unison. The attack would be massive enough to overwhelm all defenses, flooding Japanese radar with signals, swarming the skies faster than communication lines could respond. Each bomber would carry incendiary clusters designed not only to shatter factories but to ignite the very cities themselves. Every warehouse, every home, every temple built of wood would become fuel. The objective: eliminate Japan's ability to wage war and to resist. While the Americans prepared, the Japanese military worked desperately to bolster defenses. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned around key industrial zones, radar stations recalibrated, and fighter pilots retrained for high-altitude interception. But fuel shortages meant that training flights were limited. New recruits had barely a few hours in the air before being sent into combat. The famed Zero fighter, once the pride of Japan, was now obsolete against the armored American bombers. Its thin skin and weak armament could not withstand return fire. Pilots flew with courage, but their machines belonged to a past war. In the imperial palace, behind stone walls and guarded gates, Emperor Hirohito's advisors debated. Some urged negotiation, others demanded resistance to the last man. They pointed to the spirit of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as proof that Japan could endure whatever came. Still, beneath the rhetoric, fear began to settle like dust on the tatami mats. Ministers spoke in hushed tones about food shortages, collapsing transportation, and the daily fatigue of the people. They had survived years of war, but the strain was visible. Mothers lined up for rice rations that grew smaller each week. Children played among ruins. Entire neighborhoods had vanished under smaller raids. What would happen if hundreds, or even 1,000 bombers came? Thousands of miles away, in the Marianas, American airmen prepared. For every 10 pilots who boarded a B-29, there were another 100 men behind them: ground crew, logisticians, weathermen, cooks, and doctors, each link in the chain of war. They slept in tents, wrote letters home, and checked their aircraft with mechanical devotion. On some nights, the horizon glowed faintly red from test fires and fuel dumps. The atmosphere was one of expectation and of calculation. They knew the coming raid would be historic. Some felt pride, others dread. To many, It was simply their duty to finish what had begun after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a small operations hut on Tinian, General LeMay stood before a wall-sized map of Japan. Colored pins marked targets, altitudes, and flight paths. His voice was steady, his tone devoid of emotion. He explained the sequence of takeoffs, refueling points, the weather reports, and the fallback procedures. Each squadron had its assigned time, its heading, its purpose. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is not about precision, this is about power." The room was silent, except for the hum of fans and the scratching of pencils on notepads. When he finished, he simply added, "They believe we can only send 90. Let's show them what 1,000 looks like." The night before the mission, the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian pulsed with light. Floodlights illuminated rows upon rows of bombers. Mechanics checked engines, armorers loaded bombs, and crews performed final inspections. The smell of aviation fuel hung thick in the air. Radio chatter filled the command posts. Weather planes flew ahead, transmitting wind patterns and cloud cover. Chaplains moved quietly through the ranks, offering short prayers. Some airmen kept small tokens, photographs, medals, folded notes tucked into their flight suits. For many, it would be their last night on Earth. Across the ocean, Japan slept fitfully. Air raid sirens occasionally broke the stillness, but the city dwellers had grown accustomed to false alarms. Tokyo's narrow streets were dim, its buildings patched from past damage. Somewhere in a hidden bunker, the Imperial staff reviewed reports of increased American movement. An officer, young and ambitious, warned that something massive was coming. His superiors nodded, then dismissed it. "They cannot send 1,000, one general said. "Even America has limits." No one challenged him. As dawn approached in the Marianas, the engines began to roar. One by one, the B-29s taxied to the runways. The sound built into a rolling thunder that shook the ground. Each aircraft, gleaming under the floodlights, bore nose art and names, symbols of home painted on metal giants. The Enola Gay, Dauntless Dottie, Lucky Lady. The island trembled as hundreds of bombers lifted into the night sky, their propellers slicing through the humid air. From below, they looked like constellations in motion, stars migrating toward Japan. In Tokyo, radar stations along the coast detected faint blips over the ocean. Operators reported sightings of enemy aircraft in growing numbers. Communications crackled with confusion. Commanders could not believe the scale of the readings. "It must be a malfunction," one officer said. But the blips multiplied. Within an hour, confirmation arrived from multiple outposts. The unimaginable was happening hundreds upon. Hundreds of bombers approaching from the southeast. The Japanese air defense network scrambled. Fighters roared to life. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns, and air raid sirens wailed through the night. Civilians fled to shelters, clutching whatever they could carry. At 30,000 feet above the Pacific, the crews of the B-29s watched the first faint glow of dawn. The formation stretched for miles, an armada of steel and fire. Inside the lead plane, the pilot adjusted his oxygen mask and checked the coordinates. The radio crackled with LeMay's voice. "Proceed to target." Below them, the sea shimmered like molten glass. The men sat in silence, aware that history was unfolding with every mile. As the Japanese coastline appeared, defensive fire began. Tracers rose like red needles through the clouds. The gunners returned fire automatically, their turrets swiveling with mechanical precision. The first bombs fell, then the next, and then the sky itself seemed to ignite. Flames blossomed across factory districts, oil tanks exploded, and rail lines twisted in molten loops. The air grew thick with smoke, so dense that even from 30,000 feet the crews could smell the burning earth. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in hours. By noon, the raid was complete. The bombers turned back toward the sea, their mission accomplished. Behind them, Japan burned a land transformed into a landscape of ruin. The Imperial General Headquarters received fragmented reports. "Tokyo is on fire," one transmission said. Another, "Nagoya lost." The numbers were incomprehensible. The phrase repeated itself in whispers. 1,000 bombers. The legend of 90 had died in a single day. In the aftermath, Japan's war leaders sat in stunned silence. The emperor's advisors realized that their nation could not withstand another storm like this. Factories were ash, cities were graveyards, and the people's faith in victory had crumbled. The sky had delivered judgment not in words, but in flame. And as the last B-29 disappeared over the horizon, the message was clear. The age of resistance was ending. The gathering storm had arrived, and Japan could no longer outrun it. The morning broke with a pale light stretching over the Pacific, painting the sea in shades of silver and blue. On the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, that light fell upon rows of gleaming B-29 Superfortress bombers, lined up like a metallic army, ready to ascend into the heavens. It was dawn, yet there was no stillness. Engines thundered to life one after another, their deep rumble rolling across the runways like the pulse of the earth itself. Crewmen hurried across the tarmac, helmets strapped, flight suits zipped tight, checklists clutched in gloved hands. The air vibrated with tension and gasoline fumes. To the men inside the cockpits, this was not just another mission, it was the operation that would redefine air warfare. Each bomber was loaded to its limit. Incendiaries stacked in bays, armor-piercing bombs secured in racks, fuel tanks brimmed to capacity. The weight of destruction itself pressed upon those aircraft. Navigators reviewed charts lit dimly by red lamps, tracing their fingers across routes that stretched over thousands of miles of ocean. The path was clear, north by northwest, over Iwo Jima, and then toward the heart of Japan. The mission brief was simple in words, but colossal in meaning, cripple Japan's ability to fight and crush its will to resist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the edge of the Pacific, commanders watched from control towers as the first bombers began to roll. The propellers spun into a blur, and one by one, the giants lifted into the air. Their takeoff created a windstorm that bent grass and sent loose tarps flapping violently. As they rose higher, sunlight caught the silver of their wings, turning them into mirrors that reflected the rising sun. Ironically, the same symbol emblazoned on the Japanese flag below the horizon they were flying toward. Radar operators on the Japanese coast were the first to notice. The early morning static on their green screens began to shift into patterns of movement. At first, they thought it was a glitch, too many dots, too large a cluster. Then the dots multiplied. The officer in charge leaned forward, his face tightening with disbelief. He ordered immediate verification from the next outpost. The reply came almost instantly. Confirmation. Enemy aircraft approaching in mass formation. They counted the first 100, then 200, then 3. The numbers climbed with every minute. Within the hour, it became apparent that what they faced was beyond comprehension, an armada of nearly 1,000 bombers. The Japanese air defense network scrambled to life. Sirens wailed across cities, cutting through the quiet dawn. Fighters were ordered to intercept. Anti-aircraft gunners rushed to positions. Communications lines buzzed with overlapping voices, some calm, others shouting over the chaos. Yet, even as they organized, the sheer scale of the incoming wave began to overwhelm their calculations. Japan's radar system, designed for limited raids, struggled to distinguish formation clusters. To the operators, the sky appeared filled with moving storms. As the first squadrons reached the coast, dawn had broken fully. From 30,000 feet, the bombers saw the curvature of the earth itself, with Japan rising from the haze below like a sleeping giant. The pilots called out targets Kyoto, Osaka, Yokohama, Tokyo, all lined up like pearls across the chain of islands. The first bomb doors opened. Bomb racks released, and the long descent began. Thousands of incendiaries tumbled through the air, whistling faintly as they fell. Then the world below erupted in flame. Kyoto's industrial quarter was hit first. Explosions ripped through steel mills and munitions plants, sending columns of smoke rising miles high. Osaka followed its dockyards and rail depots shredded by high explosive charges. Tokyo's outskirts ignited as fuel depots along the river caught fire. In Yokohama, warehouses and refineries turned into glowing infernos. What began as pinpoint bombing quickly became a firestorm stretching across the horizon. The B-29s flew in layers, stacked formation upon formation, each dropping tons of ordnance with mechanical precision. Japanese fighters scrambled into the sky, but they were too few. Mitsubishi Ki-67s and Nakajima Ki-44s clawed for altitude, engines straining, pilots shouting coordinates into radios that crackled with static. But the bombers flew too high. Their gunners, perched in pressurized turrets, tracked incoming interceptors through computer-assisted sights. The first wave of Japanese fighters darted in bravely, only to be met with a storm of tracers that lit the sky like a constellation of red stars. One pilot, barely 20 years old, managed to graze a bomber's tail before being engulfed in fire. Another collided mid-air with a falling wreck. The courage was there, but the numbers were not. Below, the Japanese people watched the sky turn black. Civilian sirens screamed through the cities. Families grabbed whatever they could, blankets, water, children, and fled into the streets. Air raid wardens shouted for order, but chaos consumed everything. Firefighting crews could not reach the flames. The heat melted hoses before they touched the ground. Winds from multiple fire fronts merged, creating whirling pillars of flame that leapt from block to block. In some areas, the air grew so hot that oxygen burned away, suffocating entire shelters. By mid-morning, the destruction reached a scale beyond imagination. Tokyo's industrial heart was gone. Osaka's train lines twisted like melted wire, and Yokohama's harbours were seas of burning oil. The Japanese General Staff attempted to coordinate a counterattack, but communication lines were down. Generals shouted into silent receivers, waiting for reports that never came. The defence grid had fractured. Each commander operated in isolation, blind to the larger picture. What had begun as an effort to repel 90 bombers had turned into a desperate struggle for survival against 10 times that number. General Curtis LeMay, watching from the lead bomber at altitude, spoke little. His focus was absolute. He had orchestrated this operation to break Japan's resistance not just materially but psychologically. The message was simple. America's reach was limitless. From the Marianas, across the ocean, it could bring an entire nation to its knees. Inside his aircraft, radio operators reported secondary fires visible from 80 miles away. The bombardiers adjusted course, their altimeters ticking down as they prepared for another run. As the day progressed, the bombers moved in waves. Each formation passed over smouldering ruins left by the previous one. Smoke rose so high that some planes had to climb above it to avoid engine failure. The sun itself disappeared behind a shroud of ash. From below, witnesses described the sky as alive with light, noise, and terror. The thunder of explosions echoed endlessly, like the beating of an enormous drum. For hours, the rain of fire did not cease. By early afternoon, the Japanese Air Force had exhausted itself. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, pilots lost, and anti-aircraft ammunition depleted. Commanders issued the order to conserve fire, but most batteries were already destroyed or out of range. The coastal radar networks, their stations bombed or without power, went dark one by one. Japan's aerial defense, the once proud guardian of the empire, was silent. In the ruins of Osaka, a young factory worker named Haru stumbled through smoke and debris, searching for her sister. She could hear the roar of bombers overhead, so constant it blended with the wind. The ground burned beneath her feet. She reached what had been the textile mill where they both worked. Nothing remained but twisted iron and glass. When the next wave came, she threw herself into a shallow canal. The heat from above boiled the water around her. When she opened her eyes again, the sky was red. By sunset, the B-29s began their long journey back toward the Marianas. Their bomb bays were empty, their engines steady. Some aircraft limped home with damage. Others flew with empty seats where crewmates had been. But the formation held. Behind them, Japan smouldered a chain of islands transformed into a field of ruin. Fires still burned in more than a dozen cities. Columns of smoke rose higher than Mount Fuji. From that altitude, the airmen could barely see the ground. It was as if they had bombed the world itself. Reports trickled into the Imperial General headquarters throughout the night. Communications officers read casualty estimates, industrial loss figures, and intercepted radio chatter from surviving pilots. One staff colonel wrote in his logbook, "The sky has fallen." Tokyo's governor reported that firefighting resources were gone. Osaka's military command center no longer responded. Kyoto's factories were gone. Rail hubs in Yokohama were impassable. The cumulative effect was paralyzing. Japan's command structure, which had clung to the belief of a manageable conflict, now faced the reality that its homeland was defenseless. Emperor Hirohito received the initial summaries in his palace. Courtiers described him sitting motionless as the words were read aloud. He did not speak. Around him, ministers debated the scale of damage, but there were no strategies left to propose. The belief that Japan could fight on indefinitely was broken not through surrender, but through sheer exhaustion of possibility. The illusion that 90 bombers could be stopped had died in the smoke of 1,000. In Washington, the mission was hailed as a triumph of logistics and will. Newspapers called it the flood over Japan. Military analysts pointed to its precision, its magnitude, its demonstration of America's unstoppable capacity for production. Yet among the aircrews who returned, there was no celebration, only silence. They had seen cities vanish, people running through fire, and the earth itself burning. Some men wrote in their journals that night. Others stared at the ocean, realizing that history had crossed a threshold that could never be reversed. When dawn rose again over the Marianas, the bombers rested on the runways, their silver bodies streaked with soot and salt. The air smelled of oil and victory, but also of something darker finality. The men refueled, repaired, and prepared for what might come next. For Japan, the day had ended in ruins. For America, it was proof that resistance could be drowned beneath the weight of industry and resolve. The inundation had come not as a wave of water, but as a storm of fire, steel, and human ingenuity, and when it passed, it left behind a silence so complete that even the surviving winds over the Pacific seemed to hesitate, as though the world itself needed to catch its breath. In the waning light of that devastating campaign, the Japanese imperial palace stood cloaked in uneasy silence. Beneath the dark, lacquered beams of the council room, the nation's highest leaders gathered. The air was heavy with the faint scent of smoke that had drifted from the distant ruins of Tokyo. Outside, the once proud capital trembled under the weight of defeat. Inside, the imperial advisors faced a grim reality. The empire that had vowed to fight to the last soldier was now standing at the edge of collapse. What began as confidence in endurance had transformed into a desperate question of survival. The previous days had rewritten everything they had believed about war. For months, Japan's military command had assured the emperor that the homeland could withstand air attacks. They had estimated that no more than 90 bombers could strike their cities at once. But when the skies filled with more than 1,000 American B-29s, that belief was shattered. The enemy had shown strength beyond comprehension not just in weapons, but in industrial power, coordination, and relentless will. The realization struck every officer in the room. They were fighting a war they could no longer sustain. As the council convened, maps were spread across a long wooden table. Pointers traced the ruins of industrial cities, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, and Tokyo, now marked with circles of red ink. Each mark represented not just destroyed factories, but thousands of lives disrupted. The Transportation Ministry reported that more than two-thirds of the national rail system was no longer functional. The Ministry of Fuel confirmed that storage depots had been obliterated, leaving aircraft grounded and vehicles immobilized. Even the most conservative estimates painted a picture of disaster. General Anami, the war minister, clenched his jaw as he addressed the room. His voice was steady, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. "If this continues," he said, "we will have no nation left to defend." Around him, aides exchanged nervous glances. Some still spoke of honor, of holding out for better surrender terms, of making one last stand. But the majority knew the American message was clear. They had demonstrated the capacity to deliver destruction on a scale Japan had never imagined. Across the Pacific, in the command rooms of the 20th Air Force, the results were being reviewed with precision. Reports from the Marianas indicated that nearly every assigned target had been struck. Railways had been severed, oil refineries silenced, shipyards gutted. Reconnaissance photographs confirmed what planners hoped to see. Japan's industrial heart had been gutted in a single coordinated operation. The commanding officers knew the implications. They had not merely damaged Japan's war machine, they had crushed its psychological foundation. For the Japanese leadership, that was the true weapon, not just bombs, but belief. The American air raids had done what months of naval blockades and ground battles could not. They had extinguished the faith of the people in victory. Civilians, once willing to endure, were now broken by the relentless night raids, the flames, and the endless sound of sirens. Entire neighborhoods were erased in minutes. Mothers carried children through ash-covered streets, searching for water and shelter. The army could no longer hide the truth. The empire was bleeding out from within. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito listened in silence as his ministers debated. His face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. He had been told that Japan's divine destiny would ensure victory, that sacrifice would inspire survival. But now, even divine resolve could not stop the firestorms that devoured his cities. When 1,000 bombers could cross the skies unopposed, resistance was no longer a sign of strength, it was suicide. The cabinet's tone shifted from confidence to caution. Prime Minister Suzuki argued that surrender might preserve the remnants of the nation. Admiral Toyoda, speaking for the Navy, admitted that the fleet could no longer contest American control of the seas. General Umezu of the Army reluctantly acknowledged that even the Homeland Defense units were starving for fuel and ammunition. Every branch had reached the same conclusion. Continuing the war would only guarantee annihilation. The American planners, from their perspective, understood that the scale of their operation had forced this reckoning. By sending 1,000 bombers, they had not only demonstrated air supremacy, but also the limitless capacity of American industry. The message to Japan was unmistakable. If 1,000 could come today, then 2,000 could come tomorrow. The war had entered a phase Japan could not possibly match. The following morning, reports from across the country confirmed the disintegration of organized defense. Anti-aircraft batteries were silent, either destroyed or without ammunition. Fighter pilots were grounded. Local commanders began issuing unauthorized stand-down orders, instructing their men to save lives rather than waste them in futile defense. In rural areas, civilians whispered a word that had been forbidden for years: surrender. By the second day after the massive bombardment, the Imperial Cabinet convened again. The atmosphere was no longer tense with argument, but heavy with resignation. The Prime Minister's statement was simple, yet historic. To preserve what remains of our nation, we must end the fighting. The words carried across the chamber like a funeral bell. There was no applause, no debate, only silence, the silence of a nation finally accepting defeat. American intelligence soon detected changes. Radio traffic from Japanese military units decreased. Supply movements halted. Some units began surrendering to local Allied patrols in the Pacific Islands without resistance. Analysts within Washington and the Pacific Command interpreted this as the psychological breaking point the moment Japan realized that no amount of courage could withstand industrial annihilation. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito made his decision. In a private meeting with his closest advisors, he declared that further resistance would destroy not only the empire but also its people. He ordered preparations for a message to the nation, one that would later become known as his sacred decision. Though the formal surrender would still require negotiation, the essence of the choice had already been made. Japan would stop resisting. As the sun set over adjacent for the law and the Lonely, burned and broken skyline, the Japanese people sensed a change in the air. For the first time in years, the sound of approaching bombers did not come. The raids had stopped, not because of mercy, but because the mission was complete. The will to fight had been extinguished. The American strategy overwhelming force to induce psychological collapse had succeeded. The war was not yet over on paper, but in spirit, Japan had already surrendered. The empire that once believed it could endure anything had learned that endurance has limits. When faced with an enemy capable of sending 1,000 bombers in a single day, even the proudest warriors had to bow to reality. And so, in the great halls of Tokyo and the quiet ruins of its cities, the decision was sealed not with ceremony or banners, but with silence. The silence of a nation that understood it could no longer resist. The silence that marked the beginning of the end. When the last echo of engines faded beyond the horizon, a strange stillness settled over Japan. The once roaring skies, filled only hours earlier with the thunder of 1,000 bombers, now stretched silent and endless. From the ground, survivors watched in disbelief as the clouds drifted past, unscarred by contrails or smoke. The raid was over. The sound of war that had shaken the islands for so long was gone, leaving only the low hum of burning cities and the faint cries of those searching through the ruins. It was the kind of silence that did not comfort it accused. It reminded, it lingered. On the airfields of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29s returned one by one. Their crews, exhausted from the long flight, stepped down onto coral dust and squinted beneath the tropical sun. Some had flown for more than 14 hours, their minds dulled by fatigue and the weight of what they had witnessed. Engines hissed and cooled. Mechanics moved quickly, checking the bullet holes in the fuselage, counting the losses. Mission. Reports were compiled, charts reviewed, and commanders gathered around plotting tables. The figures told the story. Hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives released, entire districts of Tokyo and Osaka leveled, rail lines destroyed beyond repair, and fuel depots reduced to twisted metal. The cost to Japan's war economy was beyond calculation. For the people beneath those skies, the morning after was a portrait of devastation. Ash-blanketed streets where homes once stood. Telephone poles leaned drunkenly over shattered roads. Children wandered barefoot, eyes red from smoke and sleepless nights. The fires still smouldered in the distance, painting the horizon in an angry orange haze. What had once been neighborhoods were now grids of ruin, and the air smelled of scorched earth and silence. Amid the wreckage, one truth began to spread. Japan had reached the edge. The emperor's subjects, once urged to endure anything for victory, now faced the unbearable truth that endurance itself could mean extinction. In the imperial palace, news of the destruction arrived through fragmented messages. Communications lines were unreliable, and reports contradicted each other, but the picture was unmistakable. Cities had been flattened, rail networks severed, industrial output crippled, food deliveries disrupted. Civilian morale was collapsing faster than any military defense could recover. The phrase whispered among the ministers was simple: "The war is lost." The decision to stop resisting was no longer an abstract debate among generals. It had become an act of preservation, a desperate attempt to save what little remained of the nation's soul. On the American side, the atmosphere was mixed with exhaustion and grim satisfaction. The B-29 crews, hardened by months of missions, knew what they had accomplished. Their aircraft, the most advanced bombers of the war, had fulfilled the purpose for which they were built. Each carried a crew of 11 men. Each had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, and together they had rewritten the logic of warfare. In the air command rooms, senior officers studied the damage assessments. They knew this was not merely victory through destruction, but a demonstration of unchallengeable dominance. The once feared Japanese Empire had been brought to its knees without a single Allied soldier setting foot on its main islands. The figure that haunted Japan's defense planners' 90 bombers had long been surpassed. It was now a relic of arrogance and underestimation. Instead of 90, 1,000 aircraft had come. Instead of limited strikes, there had been total saturation. Japan's defenders had expected a storm. They received an ocean. The difference between prediction and reality was the distance between hope and despair. The sheer scale of the assault erased any illusion of control. No command, no courage, no strategy could counter such power. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was undeniable. Japanese communications, intercepted by American intelligence, revealed a shift in tone. No longer filled with defiance or the rhetoric of divine victory, the messages spoke of negotiation, preservation, and the end. Civilian administrators quietly began planning how to distribute the dwindling food supplies once the surrender came. Local commanders were instructed to maintain order but avoid confrontation. Even among the most loyal officers, the question was no longer how to fight, but how to survive. For the American High Command, the results were exactly as intended. Operation Stormfront, as the planners had called the massive air campaign, had achieved its purpose. It had demonstrated that industrial might, combined with precise coordination and overwhelming numbers, could break a nation's will faster than any invasion. In Washington, analysts compared the outcome to earlier theories of air power. They noted that the B-29 campaign had proven what strategists like General Doohay once claimed, that air dominance alone could decide wars. The skies over Japan had become a textbook example not of combat, but of coercion by scale. The rest of the world took notice. European capitals studied the reports with fascination and unease. The lesson was clear. The future of war would not always be fought on land or sea, but from the air. Nations understood that whoever commanded the skies commanded survival. The B-29, once a technological gamble plagued by failures, had now become a symbol of absolute reach and inevitability. Its legacy would shape military thinking for generations. Back in Japan, the silence deepened. The fires died out, leaving only columns of smoke that twisted upward like mourning banners. The survivors rebuilt what they could, clearing rubble, finding the lost, counting the dead. Yet beneath the sorrow was a quiet relief. For the first time in years, there were no alarms, no enemy engines overhead. The air was heavy, but it was peaceful. People could finally hear the sound of wind moving through broken windows, the rustle of paper, the echo of footsteps in empty streets. The sky that had once brought terror now offered only calm. In that calm, Japan began to confront its future. The emperor's voice, soon to be broadcast across the nation, would speak words the people had never heard before, words of surrender. But before that moment came, the silence spoke first. It carried the memory of the 1,000 bombers, of the fires that had changed everything, and of the decision that had ended a war. The sky had gone quiet, but it was not peace that filled it, it was consequence. And in that consequence, a nation humbled by destruction began its long path toward rebirth. Decades later, historians reflected on the campaign and recognized it as a watershed moment in modern warfare. The Japanese estimate of 90 B-29s had been wildly conservative. The United States had sent 1,000, and by doing so, had forced a decision to stop resisting. The war ended, the terms were imposed, the map of Asia was irreversibly altered. For America, the B-29 became more than a bomber. It became a symbol of industrial might, of logistics mastered, of air power unleashed. The cost to build and deploy the fleet was staggering, requiring billions of dollars, thousands of engineers, and tens of thousands of production workers. For Japan, the raid marked the moment when the homeland was no longer secure, and the war could no longer be won. In memory, exhausted cities turned toward reconstruction. Survivors told of skies filled with bombers, of firestorm clouds, of sudden silence after the attack ended. Japan's decision to surrender was irreversible. The momentum had shifted beyond recovery. For the world, the message was unambiguous. If 1,000 bombers could be deployed to smash rail lines, fuel depots, industrial plants, then the calculus of war had changed. Resistance was no longer a matter of courage but survival under overwhelming force. Veterans on both sides remembered the sky. For Japanese civilians, it had been a harbinger of death. For American airmen, it had been the battlefield and the path home. The number 1,000 echoed in briefings, archives, and memories as the wave that had broken resistance. As the sun set over the Pacific theater, the final dagger was not merely the nuclear bomb, but the demonstration that one could marshal, send, and sustain such overwhelming force. The Japanese estimate of 90 had been a miscalculation, corrected by America's 1,000, and the nation stopped resisting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.